Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about a winter that almost erased 7 towns from the map of Dakota Territory. Not damaged them, not inconvenienced them, erased them. This is a story about what happens when the sky decides it is done being kind, when the trains stop running for months on end, when families grind their seed wheat, the only wheat they own, the wheat they need to plant in spring just to survive the following year, into coarse flour for bread, because that is all they have left to eat. And this is the winter Laura Ingalls Wilder lived through as a 14-year-old girl, the winter she later wrote about in The Long Winter, a book she published in 1940, 60 years after the events in its pages, and a book that historians and meteorologists have since confirmed is one of the most accurate first-person accounts of a natural disaster in American frontier literature. She did not exaggerate. She did not need to. October 15th, 1880. That is the date the hard winter begins. Not December, not January. October. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the timing is the first thing that made this winter different from every other brutal Dakota winter before it. Settlers expected cold. They planned for cold. Cold in January was not a surprise. It was the schedule. But a full blizzard on October 15th, before the crops were harvested, before the root cellars were filled, before a single family had completed their winter preparations. That was not cold. That was an ambush. The blizzard came in off the prairie on the 15th with 2 feet of snow and winds that made travel impossible. Farmers across southeastern Dakota Territory were caught completely off guard. Unharvested crops sat buried under drifts. Families who had not yet dug their potatoes watched the ground freeze solid before they could reach them. Men who rode out to check on their stock that morning did not come home until the following day, if they came home at all. In Smet, Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, a young girl named Laura Ingalls was standing inside a small building with her family when that first storm hit. Smet was new, barely a year old as a proper town, its main street still smelling of green lumber, its population still counting itself in dozens rather than hundreds. The Ingalls family was among its earliest settlers. Charles Ingalls, Pa, had come to Dakota Territory in 1879, drawn like every other man on that flat, windswept plain by the same promise. Free land, a new start, one more chance to make the frontier dream come true. He had tried that dream before, of course. He had tried it in Kansas. He had tried it in Minnesota. He had tried it twice. But this time, Pa told himself, this time would be different. And for a while, for a single golden summer in 1880, it almost looked like he might be right. Now, before we talk about what happened next, I need you to understand something about Smet in the fall of 1880 that the Little House books don't quite spell out for you. This town was not ready for what was coming. No town on that stretch of Dakota Prairie was. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway had only recently laid track through Kingsbury County. The railroad was the lifeline, the only connection between these isolated prairie settlements and the supply chains that kept people fed, warm, and alive through the long months of winter. Without the railroad, Smet was simply a collection of wooden buildings sitting on an enormous flat frozen plain with nothing between it and the Arctic winds but several hundred miles of open grassland. The railroad understood this naturally. What it did not understand, what no one understood yet, was that the winter arriving in October 1880 would bury its tracks under drifts so massive, so continuous, and so rapidly renewed after every clearing attempt that the railroad would essentially stop operating for the better part of 6 months. 6 months. Think about how much food your household keeps on hand right now. Think about your pantry, your refrigerator, your cupboards. Now imagine that every store in your town closes permanently on October 15th and does not reopen until the following spring. What do you do in month 3? What do you eat in month 5? That was the question every family in Smet was about to spend the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 trying to answer. The first blizzard on October 15th was damaging, but the settlers recovered. Snow melted. People assessed their losses. Some crops had been buried, yes. Some animals had been stressed, yes. But people told themselves what people always tell themselves after the first blow. That was the worst of it. The worst is behind us now. They were wrong. They were so completely, catastrophically wrong that by December, Smet looked less like a frontier boomtown and more like a small collection of structures slowly being consumed by the Dakota Prairie. Because after the October blizzard came another, and after that one, another, and then another. and another. Blizzard after blizzard after blizzard, arriving so close together that the snow between storms had no time to melt, no time to settle, no time to be cleared from the railroad cuts before the next wave of white rolled in from the northwest. Historical records, later verified by meteorologists studying the accumulated winter season severity index, confirm that the winter of 1880 to 1881 produced snowfall accumulations of more than 11 feet in many Dakota communities. 11 feet, not 11 inches. 11 feet. The railroad cuts, which had been dug specifically to protect the tracks from snow, filled to the brim within days of each storm. Work crews were deployed to shovel them out. They shoveled. Another storm came. They shoveled again, and again, and again. By January 1881, the effort had become essentially pointless. As fast as the men cleared the cuts, the wind filled them back in. The last supply train to reach Smet before the spring thaw came and went while settlers still believed the disruption was temporary. Then the train stopped coming, and then Smet was alone. Let me tell you something about what it feels like inside a town when it slowly realizes the outside world has stopped reaching it. It doesn't happen all at once. There is no single moment when a bell rings and someone announces that the supply lines are severed. It happens the way bad things usually happen, gradually and then suddenly. First the trains are late, then the trains are irregular. Then you hear that a train tried to get through last Tuesday and was stopped 30 miles east by a drift that took 3 days to clear. Then you hear that the drift was cleared, but a new storm has already buried the line again further west. Then you stop hearing about trains altogether, and a kind of quiet falls over the town that has nothing to do with the snow outside. The shelves in Loftus's general store begin to thin. Kerosene for the lamps becomes a precious commodity. Men start burning twisted hay instead of coal, because there is no coal left in town, and there is no way to bring more. Laura Ingalls. Wilder describes this in The Long Winter. The family twisting long strands of hay into tight bundles to feed the stove. Pa's hands raw and cracked from the work. The family rotating shifts through the day to keep the fire going. Historians have confirmed this detail. The hay twisting, the coal shortage, the rationed meals, all of it. But the twist of hay in the stove is not the cruelest part of the hard winter of 1880 to 1881. The cruelest part is the wheat. By deep winter, many families in Smet and the surrounding area had exhausted their food stores. What remained in some households was nothing more than seed wheat, grain that had been set aside not for eating but for planting in the spring. This was not food. This was the future. This was next year's crop. This was the only reason to stay on a claim through another brutal Dakota winter, the knowledge that when the snow finally melted you would have seed to put in the ground and begin again. The Ingalls family began grinding their seed wheat in a coffee grinder. Charles Ingalls took the small hand-cranked grinder, the kind meant for coffee beans, not grain, and fed wheat berries through it by the painful, labour-intensive handful to produce a coarse flour. It was not good flour. It made bread that was dense and rough, and tasted nothing like the soft loaves Ma had baked through better seasons. But it was bread. It was something. And something was the difference between February and March. The Ingalls were not alone. Across town, across Kingsbury County, across 7 counties of southeastern Dakota Territory, families were making the same calculation. Eat the seed wheat now and survive the winter, or protect the seed wheat and risk dying before spring arrives. This is the choice the hard winter gave them. This is not the frontier adventure Pa Ingalls had imagined when he filed his homestead claim. This is not the story Laura wrote for children in 1940. This is the part she included anyway, because it was too real and too close and too much a part of who she became to leave out entirely. Now. There is something happening in Smet during this same winter that the history books don't always tell you about the first time around. There is a young man. He's somewhere in his early 20s. His exact age was, as it happens, a deliberate ambiguity he'd been keeping since he filed his homestead claim underage. He has a homestead claim of his own south of town. His name is Almanzo Wilder, and right now, while the Ingalls family is grinding seed wheat in a coffee grinder and twisting hay for fuel, Almanzo Wilder is sitting on his claim thinking about something he heard from a man named Cap Garland. A rumour about a farmer, somewhere out on the open prairie south of Smet, who had a cache of wheat. 60 bushels, people said. Seed wheat that had not yet been eaten, not yet traded away, not yet consumed by the desperate arithmetic of a winter that would not end. 60 bushels would not feed all of Dakota Territory. but 60 bushels could keep De Smet alive until the spring, and someone was going to have to go get it. I'll tell you exactly what happened when Almanzo and Cap rode out onto that open prairie between blizzards, and what they found when they got there. But first, I need you to understand something about the world these people were living in. Something that the Little House books told beautifully, but perhaps not completely. Because De Smet was not the only town in trouble that winter, not by a long way. We'll be right back to that wheat. But first, let's talk about what was happening to the towns around De Smet, the ones that didn't have an Almanzo Wilder. Now here is the thing that should stop you cold. Both families made it through that winter. The trains didn't run for 7 months. The seed wheat was almost gone. By February of 1881, the Ingalls family was grinding that wheat between 2 hand-turned iron plates, not cooking it, milling it, just to make something that could pass for bread, and yet both families survived. So why does that matter? Because surviving is not the same as starting over from the same place. And what happened when the snow finally melted in the spring of 1881 reveals something the books never said out loud. Both families came through the hard winter, but they did not come out equal. Think about what it takes to get through 7 months of something like that. Not romantically, practically. You need food, fuel, and enough seed wheat left over that when the ground thaws you can actually plant. Eat the seed wheat and you survive the winter, but you've traded your spring for your survival. You've borrowed against next year to pay for this one. That is the clock the Ingalls family was racing. Pa worked that hand mill every day. Laura worked it. The whole family took turns, because the iron was cold and the work was slow, and the grinding had to happen if they were going to eat. Pioneer Girl, Laura's unvarnished memoir, the one she never published in that form, describes those months with a physical plainness that the book version softens considerably. The food ran low. The fuel ran low. There were days the wind was so violent and the cold so absolute that going outside for any reason meant risking not coming back. That was the Ingalls winter. Now, I want you to hold that image. Pa at the hand mill, Laura's arms aching, the cellar getting emptier with every week. And I want to tell you about a young man named Almanzo Wilder, 23 years old, who was also in De Smet that winter. He survived too. But Almanzo came out of that winter with something the Ingalls family did not have. He came out with horses, not 1 horse, 2. A matched team, prince and lady, strong enough to pull a sled across open Dakota prairie in weather that could kill a man in under an hour. And in mid-February 1881, while the Ingalls family was still grinding wheat 1 painful tablespoon at a time, Almanzo Wilder and a young man named Cap Garland did something that people in De Smet would talk about for the rest of their lives. They drove those horses into a blizzard to find wheat. The rumour had reached town sometime in January. 60 bushels of seed wheat, held by a homesteader roughly 20 miles south of De Smet, a man Laura didn't name in the book, and whose identity scholars haven't been able to confirm with certainty, across open country with no roads, no shelter, and no guarantee the weather would hold. 20 miles each way, through the kind of cold that froze exposed skin in minutes, on ground that looked the same in every direction once the snow came down. Almanzo and Cap went anyway. They found the wheat. They brought back 60 bushels, and those 60 bushels sold to the townspeople of De Smet at a fair price, not the gouging price the only local merchant had been charging. Other reasons some of those families had enough to eat until the trains ran again in April. It is one of the most genuinely heroic acts in the entire Little House story. Laura wrote about it in the long winter, and she wrote it true. Almanzo did that. Cap Garland did that. The risk was real. The blizzard was real. The horses were real. But here is what Laura did not put in the book. Those horses were real in a very specific way. They weren't just any horses. They were the product of a kind of horse knowledge that Almanzo had been absorbing since he was old enough to walk, because his father's barn in Burke, New York had run Morgan horses, good horses, for as long as Almanzo could remember. The 1870 agricultural census schedules for Franklin County document that farms like the Wilder operation carried livestock values that put them in the upper tier of regional farms. Almanzo didn't just happen to own strong horses on the Dakota Prairie. He grew up in a household where the quality of your horse team was considered a statement of who you were. That was capital. Visible, breathing, 4-legged capital. And it made the difference between going after that wheat and staying in town. Now think about what Pa Ingalls had behind him when the hard winter ended. He had his homestead claim, 160 acres of Kingsbury County, Dakota, filed under the Homestead Act of 1862. That claim required 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation before he'd receive a land patent. Clear title, his own. He'd filed it. He was working it. He believed in it. But here is what a homestead claim is not. It is not capital. It is a promise. A federal promise that if you stay long enough and work hard enough and nothing goes catastrophically wrong, the land becomes yours. The problem is that catastrophically wrong described several of the previous years already. Kansas, Plum Creek, Burr Oak, Iowa. The year Laura left out of every book she ever wrote. Charles Ingalls had already abandoned or sold under pressure at least 3 land claims before Smet. Each one had cost him not just money but time. Years of labour poured into improvements on land he never received clear title to. Land he walked away from with almost nothing to show for it but the clothes his family was wearing. The ledger, if you could read it, showed a man who had been restarting from near zero more times than he had any reason to keep doing. And yet, he kept doing it. That is not a small thing. I want to be careful here, because the temptation with a story like this is to turn Parr into a cautionary tale, a man who couldn't learn, or wouldn't. That is not what the record shows. What the record shows is a man who understood the frontier on its own terms and genuinely believed, each time, that the next claim would be the one where the math finally worked. He was not wrong to believe that. Plenty of men around him on the Dakota Prairie were filing the same claims, planting the same wheat, making the same bet. Most of them lost too. Parr was not the outlier. He was the norm. The General Land Office records show the majority of people who filed those claims never made it to prove up. And Charles Ingalls had now abandoned his third. Charles Ingalls was not an outlier. He was the rule. The rule just didn't make it into the mythology. What made Almanzo different was not harder work. Both men worked. What made Almanzo different was the barn he came from. Not figuratively, literally. The Wilder farm in Burke, New York. The farm Laura would later write about in Farmer Boy with such loving, food-drenched detail, was a multi-building operation on established northern New York farmland that had been generating real value for decades. James Mason Wilder, Almanzo's father, had farmed that land long enough that the soil was known, the community was built, the market connections existed, the barn was big, the granary stayed full, the Morgan horses were worth more, individually, than many frontier settlers made in a full year of farming, and when the Wilder family decided to move, when James eventually sold that New York land and relocated the operation towards Spring Valley in Olmsted County, Minnesota, they did not move the way the Ingalls moved. They did not move because the math had stopped working. Land and census records, cross-referenced with the kind of farm value documentation that Caroline Fraser compiled in her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Prairie Fires, suggest the Wilders converted appreciated New York farmland into a stronger Minnesota position. They traded up. Parr Ingalls in those same years was trading sideways, or backward. Both men believed in risk. I want to keep saying that because it matters. Almanzo got on a sled in February of 1881 with a blizzard building on the horizon and drove 20 miles into open Dakota Prairie on the strength of a rumour. That is not the behaviour of a man who was afraid to risk. Cap Garland went with him. They both knew what could happen out there. The risk was genuine. But here is the thing about risk that the frontier mythology always skips. Risk is not the same for every man. Risk is different depending on what is behind you when you turn around. Almanzo rode toward that blizzard with a matched team under him, horses that had been selected, trained and properly kept, because he came from a family that understood what a good horse was worth and could afford to keep one. When he came back to Smet with 60 bushels of wheat, he came back to a homestead claim that was his first frontier gamble, not his fourth. He had not yet lost years to Kansas, or Plum Creek, or Burr Oak. His slate was not clean, exactly. But it was not covered in the kind of losses that compound into something a man can't fully recover from. Parr Ingalls went into the hard winter carrying all of those previous losses on his back, invisible, like weight in a coat pocket. The books merged their stories into one shared pioneer myth, both brave, both hard-working, both fighting the same winter. The ledger told a different story, and here is what makes it genuinely complicated, the part that keeps pulling at me, the longer I sit with these records. Almanzo's wheat rescue is real. The heroism is real. I am not trying to take it back. But that rescue was made possible in part by horses that came from a barn in Burke, New York, that the Ingalls family had no equivalent of. The 60 bushels fed de Smet, and one of the families those 60 bushels helped feed was the Ingalls family. There is no other way to say that without it landing hard. The man who would eventually marry Laura, the man whose childhood full barn Laura would later write about with such warmth and appetite, fed her family through the worst winter of her life. And he was able to do it, at least in part, because of everything that barn represented. The capital, the horses, the starting position. Both families ate that wheat. Only one of them had brought it. That silence, the space between those two facts, is where this whole story lives. Because when the spring of 1881 finally came, when the first train rolled into de Smet after 7 months, and people came out of their houses into the wet April air and actually wept, the question wasn't just who survived. The question, if you were paying attention, was who was positioned to rebuild. And that question had an answer that had very little to do with the winter itself. It had everything to do with what each family carried into it. Before we get to what rebuilding actually looked like, before we get to the land filings and the mortgage papers and the crop failures that followed the hard winter like a second ambush, there is something you need to understand about the ground both families were standing on in 1881. The Homestead Act that Pa Ingalls staked his future on was not the generous democratic instrument that the textbooks describe. It was a 160-acre promise written for a continent that would punish 160 acres. The 5-year clock started the moment you filed. It did not pause for blizzards, locusts, or failed crops. It did not care that you had already spent years and labour on 3 other claims that went nowhere. It simply counted. And Pa's clock was running. What he did not know yet, what neither he nor anyone else in de Smet fully understood in the spring of 1881, was that the hard winter was not the worst thing coming for the Dakota wheat economy. It was the opening act. The crashes that were coming would be slower and quieter than a blizzard. They would arrive as numbers on a commodity price sheet, as interest rates on seed loans, as the freight schedules of a railroad that did not answer to the people it trapped. And when those slower disasters arrived, the families with full barns behind them and the families with empty cellars were going to find out, all over again, that the frontier had never been the level playing field the dream promised. The ledger was still open, and it was about to get heavier. And here is the thing nobody tells you about Dakota Territory in 1885. It had already broken 100 families before Laura and Almanzo took their vows. The summer of their wedding, August 25th, 1885. Quiet, no church, no ceremony to speak of. The wheat fields around de Smet still looked the way wheat fields are supposed to look. Tall, gold at the edge. Heavy enough that you could almost talk yourself into believing the Dakota soil was finally going to keep its promise. Almanzo had 2 claims, a homestead and a tree claim sitting side by side on the flat open prairie just outside town. He had his horses. He had 10 years of farm knowledge in his hands from Burke, New York, how to read a season, how to pace a team, how to coax production out of stubborn ground. He had seen a full barn his entire childhood. He knew what one looked like, and he knew how to build toward one. Laura knew something different. She knew what it felt like to watch a full barn never arrive. She had spent 18 years watching her father try. She had counted flour. She had sewn buttonholes for wages. She had stood in teaching positions at 15 years old so her family could send Mary to the Iowa School for the Blind. Not because Mary deserved it any less than any other girl, but because education like that cost money the Ingalls household simply didn't have any other way to find. She knew every version of the ledger that didn't balance, so when she married Almanzo Wilder and moved to that tree claim on the Dakota Prairie, she wasn't naive. She was watching. She was calculating the same way she'd been calculating since she was old enough to understand what it meant when the flour bin got light. What the records show about those first 3 years is uncomfortable, not because the story is shameful, but because it is so familiar. The 1886 growing season failed. The tree claim wheat came in weak, stunted, not enough to cover what they owed. Seed costs, equipment costs, the note on the land. Laura and Almanzo weren't in trouble yet. They were in the place you stand just before trouble arrives, the place where you tell yourself one good season will set everything right. The 1887 season failed harder. This is the moment where the economic gap that chapters 1 and 2 documented, the full Wilder barn against the chronically thin Ingalls pantry, becomes its most complicated and most honest. Because here is Almanzo, with every advantage his background gave him. Trained hands, horse knowledge, a family that had never gone hungry through a New York winter, skills that most men on the Dakota frontier simply didn't possess, and the Prairie doesn't care about any of it. 2 bad harvests, back to back. Debt accumulating the way Dakota debt always accumulated. Seed first, then interest, then the compound silence of a ledger that grows heavier with each page you turn. The difference between Almanzo's situation in 1887 and the situation Charles Ingalls faced at Plum Creek in 1875 is not dramatic. Both men were farming on borrowed margins. Both men were watching crops fail that should have grown. Both men were working from before dawn to after dark on land that had made them a promise the weather wasn't keeping. But there is one difference, and it matters. Pa Ingalls in 1875 had behind him Kansas, Wisconsin, and the knowledge that the last time the math stopped working, his family had ended up managing a hotel in Iowa. He had no runway left. Every failed season landed on the full weight of every previous failed season. Almanzo in 1887 had behind him a New York farm that had never failed, a family still farming successfully in Spring Valley, Minnesota, skills that were portable, and the understanding, built into him bone deep from childhood, that bad seasons happen and good farms survive them. That understanding didn't save the tree claim, but it shaped the way Almanzo and Laura moved after the tree claim was gone. Then 1888 arrives, and this is the part that the Little House books never fully rendered. Laura and Almanzo both contract diphtheria that winter. They both survive, but barely, and Almanzo's recovery is not complete. The illness leaves him with a partial paralysis, a damage to his legs that never entirely heals. Biographers note that it was likely the diphtheria complications, possibly compounded by returning to farm labour too quickly, that caused the permanent weakness. He would walk with difficulty for the rest of his life. Think about what that means on a working farm in 1888. A farm runs on physical labour, every hour of it. The ploughing, the planting, the harvest, the hauling, all of it requires a body that cooperates. Almanzo had built his entire identity, his entire skill set, around being a man who could work a team of horses from dawn to dark without flinching. That was who he was. That was the inheritance from Burke, New York. Not money exactly, but capacity, physical and trained. And now that capacity was halved. The following year, 1889, their infant son dies. He's never named in any published record. He's simply gone. A grief so raw that Laura almost never spoke of it directly, and when she did, the words didn't stay long on the page. Then, the house burns. The tree claim house. The first real home they had built together, the one that was supposed to be the beginning of what the Wilder farm in New York had always represented, burns to the ground. The cause is documented as a defective stovepipe. Everything in it gone. There is a line in the first 4 years, the memoir Laura wrote about this period that her family published after her death, that sits quietly on the page like a stone. It was gone. That's all. No flourish. No dramatic recovery. Just, it was gone. This is where the ledger becomes its most devastating, not because of one failure, but because of the arithmetic of consecutive failures. Loss 1, 2 ruined harvests and the debt they left behind. Loss 2, Almanzo's body, partially, permanently. Loss 3, their son. Loss 4, the house. Any single one of those losses on its own was survivable. People survived crop failures. People survived illness. People survived grief. People lost houses to fire and rebuilt them. But not all 4, not in 4 years. Not when each one lands on the bruise left by the last. This is exactly what Caroline Fraser documented so carefully in Prairie Fires, that the disaster of the Ingalls frontier experience was never one catastrophic event. It was the compounding, each loss arriving before the previous one had been recovered from, each failure adding weight to a coat that was already heavy before the season started. What Pa had carried for 20 years, that compounding weight, Laura and Almanzo were now carrying themselves. The difference is that the Wilder background, the training, the family network, the deeper reservoir of practical skill, these things didn't prevent the fall, but they determined how far down the bottom was, and that eventually was the difference between Smet and Rocky Ridge. But before Rocky Ridge, there is something the story needs you to sit with. Something the books left entirely out. By 1889, Charles Ingalls was still in Smet, still on his claim, still trying to make the Dakota math work on land that the records show was never going to produce what a family needed to survive without supplementary income. His daughters were helping, Laura was teaching. The household was piecing itself together out of multiple small earns rather than one successful farm. Pa was in his early 50s. He had farmed, or tried to farm, his entire adult life, and he was now in a small house in a prairie town, watching his daughter and son-in-law lose their claims one season at a time just a few miles away. Whatever he said about it, the record doesn't tell us. What the record does tell us is that by this point, the two ledgers that had always sat side by side through this story were starting to look more and more alike. The Wilder fortune, the full barn, the Morgan horses, the diversified New York operation that Chapter 2 laid out in plain economic terms, had not followed Almanzo to Dakota. It had shaped him. It had given him tools and instincts that most men on the frontier didn't have, but it had not immunized him against what the Dakota Prairie was doing to every settler who tried to stake a claim on 160 acres of wheat-dependent land in the worst drought cycle the territory had seen in a generation. And that is the question this chapter is trying to put in your hands. If Almanzo Wilder, with all of that behind him, couldn't hold the tree claim through 4 consecutive disasters, what exactly did Pa Ingalls owe anyone for failing? The abandonment rate for homestead claims in Minnesota and Dakota Territory during this period runs between 50 and 60%, according to General Land Office records and the work of agricultural historian Gilbert Fite. That means more than half the people who filed, who packed everything they owned, who paid the fees, who built the claim shacks, who planted the first season with everything they had, more than half of them did not make it to prove up. They were not weak people. They were not lazy people. They were people farming in a system that was structurally hostile to anyone who arrived without capital reserves. The Ingalls family was in that majority, and now, for a brief and painful window in the late 1880s, Almanzo and Laura were walking toward it too. Here is what the books did with all of this. The first 4 years was never published in Laura's lifetime. She wrote it. The manuscript survived, but she set it aside. Her daughter Rose found it after Laura died in 1957 and published it in 1971. The reason Laura never prepared it for publication has been the subject of quiet, scholarly debate. The most honest answer is probably also the simplest. It was too close, too unmediated. There was no narrative arc that resolved cleanly into nobility and perseverance. There was just the list. Failed harvest, sickness, dead child, burned house, without the childhood golden light of the other books to soften it. The Little House series is, in its bones, a love story told backward. Laura was writing from the safety of Rocky Ridge, from the vantage point of a woman who had survived and rebuilt, and she was reaching back into her past and finding the love and the beauty that had been real even in the hardest years. The first 4 years was written before the safety arrived. It was written out of the middle of the loss, and it reads that way, spare, honest, unsentimental in a way the other books almost never are. What it doesn't do, what none of the books do, is name the structural force underneath the loss. It doesn't say the Dakota wheat economy was built on a model that required more capital than any homesteader filing a claim in 1880 could reasonably have possessed. It doesn't say commodity prices for wheat had been falling since the early 1880s as the railroads extracted freight costs from every bushel that moved east. It doesn't say the Homestead Act gave you 160 acres of federal land and then left you entirely alone on it with no credit infrastructure, no market access, and no buffer between you and a single bad season. Laura knew all of this. She had lived inside it. She just didn't put it in the books, and the reason she didn't is not dishonesty. It's something more human than that. She was writing about her father's dignity, and her husband's hands, and the particular kind of love that holds a family together when everything else is coming apart. She wasn't wrong to do that. But the thing she left out, the structural economic weight underneath the dignity and the love and the hands, that thing is still sitting there in the census records and the homestead files waiting. The question this chapter is leaving you with is not the one you might expect. It's not, why did Laura leave it out? It's this. By 1889, with Almanzo's legs damaged, and their house ash, and their son buried, and their wheat debt still on the books, When Laura sat down in whatever shelter they had left and tried to calculate the next move, was she thinking about what her father had always said about the frontier? About open land and hard work and a man being free to make his own way? Or was she thinking about a barn in Burke, New York, that she had heard about her whole married life? That question doesn't have a recorded answer. But the next chapter does, because 1894 is coming, and what Laura and Almanzo decide to do next, and how they managed to do it when Pa Ingalls, in the same years, in the same territory, simply cannot, is where the two ledgers finally stop pretending they were ever the same book. In the summer of 1894, Laura Ingalls Wilder packed everything she owned into a wagon. Not everything she had hoped to own, not everything she had been working toward for 9 years, just everything that was actually left. A little furniture, some bedding. Their daughter Rose, 7 years old, riding up on the seat between her parents. Almanzo at the reins, his hands still knowing what to do with a team even when the rest of his body had become unreliable. And somewhere in that wagon, probably folded into a coat or slipped between the boards, $100. $100. That was what stood between Laura and Almanzo Wilder and starting over with nothing at all. And it didn't belong to them. It was a loan. From her parents. From Pa and Ma Ingalls still in Smet, still making the Dakota math work the only way it had ever worked for them. Barely, and together. Sit with that for just a moment. The man who had grown up with full barns, Morgan horses, and a New York farm that never once failed to put food on the table. He was leaving the frontier with 100 borrowed dollars and a partial paralysis that would follow him the rest of his life. And the woman who had spent her entire childhood watching her father count flour and pray for good wheat. She was the one calculating whether that $100 could get them to Missouri and still have enough left to buy land. This is where the two ledgers finally show you their real bottom line. Missouri was a deliberate choice, not a desperate one. That distinction matters. The Ingalls family had always moved under pressure, one step ahead of a failed claim, a drained season, a mortgage that wouldn't bend. The pattern Chapter 3 documented wasn't just bad luck. It was the pattern of a family that moved when staying became impossible. Laura and Almanzo's move to Mansfield, Wright County, Missouri, was different in a specific and important way. They had decided to stop gambling on wheat. Dakota had taught them something that no amount of Wilder farm training could have taught ahead of time, that single-crop wheat farming on the Great Plains, in that drought cycle, with those commodity prices on 160 homestead acres, was not a survivable model for anyone who arrived without deep capital reserves. Almanzo had grown up watching his father run a diversified farm. Horses, hay, root crops, dairy, grain, the whole rotating system that kept the barn full regardless of what any single harvest did. He knew, better than most men on the Dakota frontier, what a properly structured farm looked like. He just hadn't been able to build one on the tree claim. Nobody could. The land and the system wouldn't let you. So they turned south, and when they found the Ozarks, something in both of them apparently recognized what they were looking at. Not flat, not exposed, not dependent on one crop in one brutal growing window, wooded hills, springs, a gentler climate, and soil that could hold apple trees. Rocky Ridge Farm was not a rescue. It was a reconstruction, and it was slow, painfully, grindingly slow. The kind of slow that the Little House books, which readers knew had a happy ending, never fully captured. When Laura and Almanzo arrived in Mansfield in 1894, they paid the 100 borrowed dollars for a small, rough farmstead. 40 acres, a one-room log house, land that needed years of clearing before it would produce anything worth selling. They were starting from a position that was, on paper, not dramatically different from a homestead filing in Dakota. Cheap land, no infrastructure, no income yet. But there were two things different about Rocky Ridge that the Dakota claims never had. The first was the land itself, Ozark Hill country, with enough natural diversity that even a bad apple year didn't kill everything. The second was Almanzo's understanding of what a farm needed to become before it could survive. He had seen that in New York. He had a picture in his mind of the full barn, the diversified operation, the farm that didn't depend on any single season being perfect. He was building toward that picture, slowly, even when the body doing the building didn't cooperate the way it used to. Carolyn Fraser, in Prairie Fires, traces the early Rocky Ridge years with careful attention to the financial reality. The farm took years to become viable. Laura and Almanzo both worked other jobs during the lean period. Laura kept house for neighbours, Almanzo drove for hire. The orchard took time to mature, the dairy took time to build. There were years when the ledger was still thin, still precarious, still nothing like what Almanzo's father had commanded from that New York farm. But the direction was different. For the first time in either family's story, the direction was upward and staying upward. Now look at what is happening in Smet at the same time. Charles Ingalls is in his late 50s. He has been in Dakota territory for nearly 2 decades. He filed his homestead claim in the early 1880s, and he did eventually prove up on it. One of the things this story should give him clear credit for, because proving up on a Dakota homestead was genuinely hard. He held on. He survived the hard winter. He survived the crop failures that sent 50 to 60% of his neighbours packing. But surviving is not the same as building. By the mid-1890s, Per Ingalls has moved off the farm claim and into a small house in town. Not because he chose comfort over land, but because his body was failing and the farm was not producing enough on its own to justify the physical cost. He is doing carpentry work. He is taking in income where he can find it. His daughters, Carrie, Grace and occasionally Laura from Missouri, are helping to support the household. The independence that had been the whole point, the single, animating dream behind every move, every claim, every failed crop and new start. That independence, in the material sense, was never fully achieved. History remembered Charles Ingalls as the man who took his family west and gave them a life worth writing about, and that is true, he did. But the record that sits underneath the story, the deed transfers, the crop reports, the small house in town, tells you that the dream of the self-sufficient frontier farm never quite solidified into something that stood on its own, not for lack of trying, not for lack of love or character or grit, but because grit, without capital behind it, cannot carry every weight the frontier put on your shoulders. There is a question that has been moving quietly through this entire documentary, since the very first image of a full barn in New York and a thin Ingalls cellar. It's not a harsh question, but it's an honest one. What would have happened to Charles Ingalls if he had started where Almanzo started? Not with the same personality, not with the same restlessness or music or love of open land, just with the same ground beneath his feet at the beginning, an established farm in an established region. A family that had been on the same land long enough to have equity in it, neighbours who had credit and community, and a generation of agricultural knowledge behind them. The kind of start that doesn't guarantee success, but doesn't put the whole family's survival in a single season's hands. The records don't answer that. They can't. But here is what they do tell you. By 1900, Rocky Ridge Farm is functioning. The orchard is producing. Almanzo and Laura are building a real farmhouse. Not a claim shack, not a one-room log cabin, but a house with a parlour and a porch and enough room to suggest that the people living there expect to stay. Laura is writing for the Missouri Ruralist, a farm journal, earning income from her words. They are not wealthy, but they are rooted. 2 miles from where he is buried and 50 years of failed claims behind them, Charles Ingalls is renting a house in Smet. He dies on June 8, 1902. He is 66 years old. The death records put him in a small house in town. His estate, documented by local records and referenced in John E. Miller's biography, is modest. He has not accumulated meaningful land equity. He has not built a farm that outlasted him. Ma will live in that Smet house until she dies in 1924. The daughters will help support her. There is no cruelty in saying any of this plainly. The cruelty would be in not saying it. Because what the Little House books gave Charles Ingalls, the dignity, the music, the fiddle singing across the prairie, the love of his daughters and the unfailing warmth of his presence, all of that is real, and none of that requires a full barn to validate it. But a man's dignity and his economic position are 2 different things, and for too long, the story only measured one of them. The ledger image has been sitting in this documentary since chapter 1. 2 account books, one labelled Wilder, one labelled Ingalls, lines for land, livestock, debt and sales. 2 families operating in the same era, under the same national mythology of frontier opportunity, working with the same hours in a day and the same commitment to the land. By the time both books close, roughly 1902, roughly the year Pa dies, and Rocky Ridge is beginning to stand on its own. What do the 2 ledgers actually show? The Wilder ledger shows a New York farm that produced enough equity to fund a move to Minnesota, a training ground that gave Almanzo skills most frontier men never had, and eventually, after a decade of Dakota disaster, a Missouri farm that held. The barn in New York didn't follow Almanzo to Dakota, but what it had built inside him, the instinct toward diversification and patience in the long game, eventually found ground that could hold it. The Ingalls ledger shows decades of motion, of claims filed and abandoned and sold under pressure, of a family kept alive by the combined labour of everyone in it, and a patriarch who died in a rented house without having achieved the thing he had spent his life trying to build. Two sets of numbers, two entirely different starting points. Both men called it the same thing, the American frontier dream. And here is what Laura did with both of them. She sat down in her farmhouse at Rocky Ridge, the farmhouse that had taken 20 years to become real, and she wrote. She wrote about Pa's fiddle, about the long winter, about the little house in the big woods, and the sound of the creek and the smell of fresh bread, and the particular quality of lantern light on a prairie night. She wrote about Almanzo's farm in New York, as though the feasts and the horses and the full cellar were simply what pioneer life looked like when you did it right. She did not write a single chapter about the Burr Oak Hotel. She did not write about the weight that landed on each failed claim. She did not write about what it cost Pa, year after year, to keep moving with hope he couldn't quite afford and land that almost never delivered what he needed it to. And she did not write a single line connecting Almanzo's New York barn, that enormous, hay-filled, horse-warm beginning, to the different kind of frontier he had been standing on all along. She was not hiding anything exactly. She was doing something more human than hiding. She was choosing what to preserve. She knew what her father had been. She knew what her husband had come from. She had lived inside both stories from different angles, and she understood the distance between them in a way no reader of the books ever quite could. But she also understood that what her father had given her, the music, the love, the unshakable sense that the people in the little house were enough for each other no matter what the ledger said, that was not a small thing. That was not something to qualify or footnote or subject to economic analysis. So she wrote about that. She wrote the version of the story where love and hard work and goodness build a life. She wrote it for children. She wrote it beautifully. She left the other ledger in the drawer. It has been there ever since. And when you pull it out, when you lay the two books open side by side and read the actual numbers, the census schedules and the deed transfers and the homestead filings and the small house into Smet, the story doesn't become smaller or sadder or less worth loving. It becomes more honest. Two families, two ledgers. One American myth that loved them both equally and never mentioned that they had not started from the same place. The barn in Burke, New York is still standing. Pa Ingalls never had one. And the question that lives in the space between those two facts, whether we should praise frontier grit the same way when one man carries it with a full barn behind him and another carries it with nothing but the belief that the next season will be different, that question has not stopped being worth asking. It is in fact exactly the question this country has been asking, in different words, ever since. She saved that $100. That's the first thing worth knowing about Laura Ingalls Wilder. The woman, not the character. Not the girl with the braids in the surveyor's house, not the schoolteacher riding home in the cutter, not the little house on the prairie. The woman who sat down in Missouri in her 40s with a stack of blank paper and decided very carefully what to include. She saved the $100 her parents lent her and Almanzo in 1894, tucked it in her writing desk, according to Rose's later account, and she never forgot where it had come from. A family that had almost nothing, giving what they had. That is what this chapter is about. Not the books, what's underneath them. Think about the wagon road out of De Smet. Not the romantic version, not the open horizon and the bright July sky that Rose later painted into the account of their departure. The real version. Laura was 27 years old. Almanzo was 37, and his hands shook sometimes from the nerve damage the diphtheria had left behind. They had a 7-year-old daughter. They had a trunk, some bedding, a small amount of cash, and a letter of credit their neighbour had written them. They had spent 9 years in Dakota Territory. 9 years of drought years and crop failures and debt and a dead baby boy, and a house that had burned, and a husband whose body was not the same as it had been before the illness. 9 years. And behind them in De Smet, in a modest house on 3rd Street, not a farm, was Pa, Charles Ingalls, 57 years old, done. He would never leave Dakota again. He would live another 8 years in that rented house in town, working odd jobs, slowly going still, and he would die there on June 8, 1902, at 66, with a modest estate that did not include land. The man who had filed homestead claims in 4 territories, who had built more houses than most men dream of, died without owning one. Just sit with that for a moment. Before we go any further, let it sit. Because there is something happening on the other side of this story at the exact same time, something the books never put next to each other. While Laura and Almanzo were pulling that wagon south toward Missouri, Almanzo's parents were in Spring Valley, Minnesota, on a farm they had chosen, not fled to, chosen. James Wilder, the patriarch of the barn full of Morgan horses, had sold New York land that had been in the family long enough to accumulate genuine equity, and moved the household to a better-positioned Minnesota operation. According to records examined by biographer Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires, the Wilder move to Minnesota was a trade-up. They converted established land value into new land value. They had assets before the move. They had assets after it. Charles Ingalls' last move to Smet had been a trade sideways at best. More accurately, it was one more restart from near zero, 2 men, same era, same fever dream of the American frontier. One man's family moved towards something. The other man's family moved away from things that hadn't worked. If you've been watching since Chapter 1, you already know where that difference came from. You already know about the barn. You know about the grasshoppers and the empty cellar and the walking east to hire out as a harvest labourer and the Plum Creek mortgage and Burr Oak. The year Laura never put in any book. You know all of it. But here's what we haven't asked yet. What did Laura know? She knew everything. That is the quiet answer. And it makes the book stranger, not simpler. When Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down in 1930 to write what would become Pioneer Girl, the raw, unpolished manuscript that her daughter Rose eventually helped reshape into the Little House series, she was 63 years old. She had lived inside both economic worlds. She had spent her childhood watching Pa's hands on a fiddle, and Pa's eyes on a horizon that always seemed to promise something just beyond reach. She had spent her young adulthood watching Almanzo's world, not the New York barn. That was his memory, not hers. But the expectation behind his eyes, the way a man raised with working capital moves through risk differently than a man who never had any. She had watched both. She had written about both. And she made choices. That is not an accusation. This is the part that matters most, and it has to be said carefully, because Laura Ingalls Wilder deserves better than a simple verdict. She did not lie. The events in the books happened. Mary went blind. The grasshoppers came. Pa walked east for wages. The long winter was real. The baby boy died. She mentioned him only obliquely in the first 4 years, which wasn't published until after her death. She did not manufacture a frontier that never existed, but she shaped the story. She compressed it. She smoothed it. She made choices about what the ledger would show. Here is what Laura left out of the books. She left out Burr Oak entirely. An entire year. A family running a hotel in Iowa. Charles working as a hired man. The children helping in a boarding house. Gone. Not mentioned once across 9 books. Pamela Smith Hill, who edited the annotated Pioneer Girl for the South Dakota Historical Society Press in 2014, noted that the Burr Oak episode appears in the manuscript but was removed from the books. The most defeated year of Charles Ingalls' life simply doesn't exist in the version most Americans grew up reading. She left out the exact weight of the debt, the Plum Creek mortgage, the seed loans, the equipment credit. They appear as background texture in the books, but never as the central, grinding, structurally inescapable pressure they actually were. You feel hardship in the books. What you don't feel is the specific, documented mathematics of a family that cannot get out from under what it owes. She left out the comparison. This is the most interesting choice of all. Laura wrote Farmer Boy, an entire book about Almanzo's childhood, without once pausing to let the reader notice that the world in that book and the world in Little House on the Prairie are economically almost opposite. She wrote both. She put them on the same shelf. She never connected them with a single sentence about why one cellar was always full and the other was always at risk. John E. Miller, in Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder, his 1998 biography out of the University of Missouri Press, describes Laura as a careful, deliberate craftswoman who understood her audience and her moment. She was writing for children in the 1930s during the Great Depression, for a country that needed to believe that hard work and love and goodness were enough. The books gave people that. They still do. That is not nothing. That is something very important, actually. But the ledger underneath the books tells a different story, and we've been reading it together since the first chapter. So, let's open it one more time. Let's put both account books on the table, the Wilder one and the Ingalls one, and read the last pages. The Wilder barn still stands. You can visit it in Malone, New York today. The Almanzo Wilder homestead is a museum, maintained by the Almanzo and Laura Ingalls Wilder Association. The structure is still there. Big timbers, a barn built for multiple horse teams and enough hay to get through a New York winter, built by a family that had been on that land long enough to build something meant to last. It lasted. 150 years later, it is still standing. Charles Ingalls' last home in Smet, South Dakota, not a farm, remember, a house in town, is also a historic site. The surveyor's house, the house where the family sheltered in the long winter, is preserved. But the property where Charles died, the modest in-town house where he spent his last years, is notable mostly for what it is not. It is not a farm. It is not land he owned. He died in a rented house in a town he had settled decades before, and the land around Smet, the land he'd filed claims on, the land the railroad had made valuable, the land the Homestead Act had theoretically given him access to, that land had passed through his hands without leaving him anything permanent to show for it. The Wilder barn is still standing. Pa died in a rented house. That is not poetic license. That is documented history. Now here is the question that the ledger forces you to ask, the one that this whole documentary has been slowly, carefully building toward. What does it mean to celebrate frontier grit equally when the starting lines were that far apart? Not just Pa versus Almanzo's father, not just one family versus another, but the whole mythology, the idea that the frontier was a level field where character and hard work determined who made it. The Little House books built that myth, and they built it beautifully, and generations of American children, mostly girls actually, daughters who wanted to be Laura, grew up believing that the reason some families made it and some didn't was fundamentally about who they were. The census records say something different. The land office filings say something different. The grasshopper reports and the seed company ledgers and the railroad freight schedules say something different. They say it was about where you started. Not only, not entirely. Both families worked. Both men believed in what they were doing with a conviction that is actually moving to read about, even now. Charles Ingalls was not a man without agency. Almanzo Wilder was not a man without courage. This is not a story with a villain, but one of them had a full barn behind him, and one of them didn't. And that difference, documented, measurable, visible in the census agricultural schedules from Franklin County, New York and Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, that difference mattered more than the books ever let on. Laura understood this. At some level, she had to have understood this. She had lived in Almanzo's parents' household during the early years of her marriage. She had seen the Spring Valley, Minnesota farm. She had experienced up close what a family with land equity and community roots looked like from the inside. The ease of it, the way problems got solved rather than accumulated, the way a bad season was a setback rather than a catastrophe. And she had come from a family where a bad season was everything, where Pa walked east for wages, where she taught school at 15 and sewed shirts to help cover debts, where the $100th bill in her writing desk had come from parents who could barely spare it. She knew both worlds, she wrote about both worlds, and she made them look equivalent. That is the most human thing in this entire story. Not the grasshoppers, not the diphtheria, not the empty pantry or the full barn. The most human thing is that a woman who loved her father, genuinely, deeply, with the kind of love that is still palpable on every page she wrote about him, chose to tell his story in a way that protected him. That made him a hero rather than a case study in structural disadvantage. That made the fiddle music and the courage and the big blue eyes more central than the mortgage, and the abandoned claims, and the rented house in Smet where it all ended. You would do the same, you probably would. But here is what the ledger doesn't lie about. Laura and Almanzo arrived in Mansfield, Missouri in 1894 with that $100 from her parents, a small amount of additional cash, and a letter from a neighbour that helped them secure a 40-acre piece of land called Rocky Ridge Farm. The land was rough and wooded and steep. The Ozarks were not the Dakota Plains, not the kind of country you farm with a wheat drill and a prayer, but they were different in a way that turned out to matter. Rocky Ridge was going to be about apples, and some dairy, and diversification. The same word that explains why the Wilder farm in New York survived bad seasons while the Ingalls wheat crops in Dakota got destroyed by them. Laura and Almanzo weren't building a single crop operation. They were building something layered, multiple income streams. Apple orchards, which take years to mature, which require the kind of patience you can only afford if you aren't betting everything on one harvest. And then chickens and hogs, and eventually dairy, and eventually a bigger house built by Almanzo's damaged hands one piece at a time over years. It worked. Rocky Ridge Farm eventually grew to 200 acres. The house Almanzo built there is still standing. The Rocky Ridge Farm Museum in Mansfield, Missouri preserved it. By the 1910s, Laura and Almanzo were genuinely comfortable. Not New York Wilder comfortable. Not full barn, hired hand, Morgan horse comfortable. But stable. Self-sufficient in a way that Pa Ingalls never quite managed to sustain for long enough. And the reason it worked, the reason Missouri worked when Dakota hadn't, is worth looking at carefully, because it isn't just about luck or character or hard work. They made a structural choice. They chose diversification over monoculture. They chose a milder climate with reliable rainfall over the high-risk, high-volatility wheat country of the Great Plains. They chose to build slowly rather than bet everything on a single season's crop. Those were choices, and they were the right choices. But they were also the same structural logic that had kept the Wilder barn full in New York for decades, while Pa was gambling on single-crop wheat in Dakota. The lesson was always there. It just took a long time to be applied to the right ground. By 1911, Laura Ingalls Wilder was writing columns for the Missouri Ruralist, a regional farm paper under her own name. They were practical pieces mostly: farming advice, household management, the economics of poultry keeping, the lessons of the orchard. Nothing that looked like the Little House books that were still 20 years away. But if you read them now, you can hear something underneath the practical voice. A woman who understood, with great precision, how a farm works and doesn't work. What saves a farm and what destroys it. How the margins operate and where they break. She had learned this the hard way. Both ways, actually. The Ingalls way and the Wilder way. She wrote the Missouri Ruralist columns for more than a decade before she ever attempted the Little House books. And when she finally sat down to write Pioneer Girl in 1930, the raw autobiographical manuscript that is as close to Laura's unmediated memory as we are ever likely to get, the book was different from the version that eventually got published. It was more bitter in places, more honest about the weight of the debt, more willing to name the failures for what they were. Rose helped reshape it. Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's daughter, was by 1930 a successful commercial author. She understood what the market wanted and what it didn't. And what the market wanted in the depths of the Great Depression was not a forensic account of everything frontier poverty felt like from the inside. What the market wanted was courage, resilience, love holding a family together through winters that should have broken them. That is what Little House in the Big Woods delivered in 1932, and it sold. And Laura kept writing, one book a year through the decade, building the series that became one of the most beloved bodies of children's literature in American history. The books are real. The love in them is real. The courage is real. Pa's fiddle in the dark and Ma's steadiness and the way the family held itself together through things that would have broken most people. None of that is invented. But the ledger was never shown. This is the last thing the ledger tells us. Caroline Fraser, who won the Pulitzer Prize for her 2017 biography Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, spent years in the census records and the homestead files and the land office documents. And what she found, documented in exhaustive, footnoted, carefully sourced detail, is that the gap between what the books show and what the records show is not accidental. It is the gap between what Laura wanted her father to be and what the records say he was. It is the gap between a beloved childhood story and a clear-eyed account of what the frontier actually did to families who arrived without capital. It is the gap between a myth built for comfort and a history built on evidence. Fraser's conclusion, and it is a careful one, a compassionate one, is that Laura shaped the truth rather than suppressing it. That she honoured the emotional reality of her childhood while softening the economic mathematics of it. that she built a myth because myths are what people need sometimes, and because she loved the people in the story, and because she was a woman of her time and her market and her audience. But the gap is real. The census schedules are real. The land filings are real. The rented house in Smet is real. The Wilder barn in Malone is real. 2 families, same frontier, same era, same faith in hard work and the promise of American land. One family left a barn that is still standing. The other family left books, and the books are magnificent, genuinely, enduringly magnificent. But they are also a kind of ledger, one that balanced love and courage on one side and left the hardest numbers off the page. You have been reading the numbers that Laura left off the page, not to diminish her, not to reduce Pa to a bad farmer or Almanzo to a rich man who got lucky. Both of those are too simple, and simple is what this story refuses to be. What you have been reading is the fuller account, the one that includes the barn and the cellar, the Morgan horses and the harvest labour wages, the New York equity and the Dakota debt, the one that asks quietly and without anger whether 2 men who both believed in the frontier dream and both worked themselves to exhaustion deserve to be remembered as if they started from the same place. They didn't. The Wilder barn was full before Almanzo ever left for Dakota. The Ingalls pantry was running thin before Laura ever learned to read. That's not a moral judgment. It's a line in the ledger, and it was always there. Laura knew it was there. She just chose, for reasons that are deeply human and completely understandable, not to write it down. There is a moment, if you have ever loved a book deeply, where you stop reading it and start living in it, where the story stops being something that happened to characters on paper and becomes something that happened to you, personally, somewhere in the part of your memory that doesn't distinguish between real and invented. That is what the Little House books did to an entire country, not just for the children who read them in the 1930s and 1940s, not just for the girls who braided their hair and pretended the backyard was a Dakota prairie, but for America structurally, in its classrooms, its libraries, its conversation about what the frontier was, what hard work meant, and whether the country had always offered the same fair chance to everyone who tried hard enough. The ledger we've been reading together, the one with the Wilder numbers on one side and the Ingalls numbers on the other, that ledger didn't disappear when Laura sat down to write. It went underground. It became the foundation underneath one of the most widely taught, most beloved, most ideologically load-bearing bodies of children's literature in American history. And for a long time, nobody looked at it. Think about the timing. Little House in the Big Woods came out in 1932. The country was 3 years into the Great Depression. Banks had failed. Farms had failed. Families had packed everything they owned into cars and driven west looking for something that wasn't there. The Dust Bowl was 3 years from its worst. The national conversation about work and worth and whether America's promise was real was not abstract. It was happening at kitchen tables, in bread lines, in the letters people wrote to Roosevelt begging for something to hold on to. Into that moment, a 65-year-old woman in Missouri published a children's book about a family living in a log cabin in Wisconsin, making their own bullets, smoking their own meat, dancing at night to a father's fiddle, and being, in every way that the Depression was not, enough. The books did not become beloved because they were sentimental. They became beloved because they answered a question millions of people were quietly asking themselves, did hard work ever actually work? Laura's answer, page after page, book after book, was yes. Not effortlessly, not without suffering, but yes. The fiddle played, the family held, the prairie was hard and the winter was long, but the love was real and the work was honest, and that was enough. That answer was exactly what the country needed, and it planted itself in a generation's understanding of what America was supposed to be. But here's what happened next, and this is the part that matters most to the story we've been tracking. The books didn't stay in the 1930s, they grew. By the 1950s, the Little House series was a standard school curriculum text across the United States. By the 1960s, it had become one of the most assigned works in American elementary schools, not just as literature, but as history, as an account of what pioneer life was actually like, as evidence of what the frontier had been. Teachers assigned it in history units. Libraries shelved it next to American biography. Parents gave it to daughters as a picture of what American girlhood meant. The books crossed the line from fiction to something that functioned in the broader culture almost as documentary. And once a story starts functioning as documentary, the thing it leaves out becomes invisible in a different way than it was before. It's no longer just an omission in a children's book. It becomes a gap in the national record, a hole in the way a culture understands itself. The barn versus the cellar, the full ledger versus the empty one, the starting line that was never the same. All of it, gone. Not because anyone decided to hide it, but because a story beloved enough and repeated often enough eventually becomes the truth it was only ever meant to resemble. Now here is the figure this chapter cannot avoid. Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's daughter, born in Smet, Dakota Territory in 1886, in the first hard year of her parents' marriage. She grew up in Missouri at Rocky Ridge, helped her mother shape Pioneer Girl into a publishable book in the early 1930s, and became, before any of the Little House books existed, one of the highest-paid magazine journalists in America. Her byline appeared in major national publications. She travelled to Europe and the Middle East. She wrote profiles and travel pieces and fiction that earned real money in the 1920s before the Depression wiped most of that out. Rose is complicated, and the documentary record around her is complicated, and the question of how much she actually wrote versus how much she shaped versus how much was genuinely Laura's alone is a scholarly debate that has its own full universe of argument. That debate is not what this chapter is about. What this chapter is about is the ideology. Because Rose Wilder Lane, by the early 1930s, had developed a set of political beliefs that were specific and passionate, and that found their way, scholars argue about how directly and how deliberately, into the texture of the Little House books themselves. Rose was one of the founding figures of American libertarianism, not as a fringe position, but as a serious intellectual framework. In 1943, the same year Laura published These Happy Golden Years, the final book in the original series, Rose published The Discovery of Freedom, one of the foundational texts of American individualist political philosophy. Her argument, in simple terms, was that individual freedom and self-reliance, unconstrained by government, were the essential conditions of human flourishing, that the frontier embodied these values at their purest, that the pioneer, self-sufficient, government-independent, earning everything through labour and ingenuity, was the highest expression of what America was supposed to be. It is not an accident that this is also, emotionally and thematically, the argument of the Little House books. Historians and literary scholars have spent decades carefully mapping the overlap between Rose's political philosophy and the books she helped shape. Jennifer Quist, William Holtz in his 1993 biography The Ghost in the Little House, and more recently Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires. They all address this in different ways, with different conclusions and different levels of directness about Rose's specific contributions to the text. What they agree on, broadly, is this: whether or not Rose wrote specific sentences or entire passages, and the evidence that she did is substantial. The ideological framework of the books, the specific moral universe in which individual self-reliance and government independence are the core virtues, was shaped at least partly by Rose's beliefs. And that framework required a specific kind of erasure. To make the frontier a story about individual virtue, you have to remove the structural factors, the capital, the land equity, the community infrastructure, the starting position, that actually determined who made it and who didn't. You have to make pairs' failures into weather and illness and bad luck, not into the predictable consequences of low-capital farming without a safety net. You have to make Almanzo's family's prosperity into the natural reward of good Yankee work ethic and practical wisdom, not into the cumulative advantage of decades of land appreciation in an established agricultural region. You have to, in other words, close the ledger. The Little House was built on a specific philosophy, and that philosophy required that the full barn and the empty cellar never appear on the same page as an economic comparison. Sit with that for a second. Because this is not a small thing. The books that shaped how millions of American children, mostly girls, growing up to be women who would vote and teach and raise families and think about fairness. The books that shaped how those children understood what the frontier meant, what hard work meant, what the American promise was. Those books had a specific ideological architecture underneath the love and the fiddle music and the long winter. Not a secret conspiracy, not a fraud. Just the natural consequence of what happens when a story is shaped by someone who believes, with genuine conviction, that individual self-reliance is the supreme American value, and that government assistance and structural advantage are beside the point. In that framework, the Wilder barn doesn't mean what the ledger says it means. It just means the Wilders worked hard and made smart choices, and the empty Ingalls cellar doesn't mean what the ledger says it means. It just means Pa was unlucky or restless, or perhaps slightly too trusting of the horizon. The myth ate the math, not maliciously, just thoroughly. And then the television came. In 1974, 42 years after the first Little House book, 72 years after Pa died in that rented house in Smet, NBC premiered Little House on the Prairie, starring Michael Landon as Charles Ingalls. If the books had planted the myth in a generation's childhood, the television show industrialized it. The show ran for 9 seasons, until 1983. At its peak, it was one of the most watched programs in the United States. It went into syndication, and has aired continuously ever since, in dozens of countries. It remains today one of the most recognized American television properties in the world. And the television Pa was not the census Pa. The television Pa was Michael Landon, physically imposing, emotionally open, occasionally tearful in the way that made 1970s audiences feel something important was happening. He was noble, resourceful, occasionally wrong but always moral, and the Walnut Grove he presided over was a community where honest work and good character were reliably rewarded. The show moved even further from the economic record than the books had. The Ingalls family on television had a decent house and neighbours and a doctor and a school and, crucially, a kind of middle-class stability that the actual Ingalls family never sustained for long. The mortgage pressure, the failed claims, the hired-out labour seasons, the rented townhouse where Charles died, none of it was there. The full barn of the Wilder world and the empty cellar of the Ingalls world had, by 1974, merged into a single warm television household where the problems were always solved before the credits rolled. 30 million people a week watched that household, and they absorbed it as history. Here is the question the ledger forces you to ask about all of this. What is the cost of a myth that convincing? Not the romantic cost, not the lost poetry of Pa's real failures, not the erasure of the historical Ingalls, the structural cost, the cost of a century of children absorbing the idea that the frontier was a level playing field where character determined outcome, while the actual economic record showed something structurally different. Because that idea, that starting position doesn't matter, that hard work is what separates the full barn from the empty cellar, that idea didn't stay in the 19th century, it travelled forward. It became part of the American conversation about poverty and success, and deserving and not deserving in ways that the Little House books obviously never intended and could not have predicted. But a story powerful enough to function as national myth doesn't stay contained to its original intention. It shapes the questions people think to ask, and more importantly, the questions they don't think to ask. Nobody who loved Pa Ingalls in 1938 asked why a man who worked as hard as he did never managed to hold land. The books had already answered that question before it was asked. He was unlucky. He was adventurous. The winters were bad. The grasshoppers came. The frontier was simply hard. What the books had not asked, could not ask, given their genre and their moment, was whether the frontier was structurally harder for some families than others. Whether a man starting from near-zero capital faced a different problem than a man starting from a full barn. Whether the same frost that cost the Wilders a crop and cost the Ingalls a farm was the same event in any meaningful economic sense. That question lived in the ledger. And for decades, the myth was loud enough that the ledger was very easy not to hear. Then, in 2014, something changed. Pamela Smith Hill edited and published Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography through the South Dakota Historical Society Press. It was the first time Laura's original manuscript, the raw, pre-Rose, pre-Harper and Brothers memoir that had never been published in her lifetime, was available to the public in a fully annotated scholarly edition. The difference between Pioneer Girl and the Little House books is the difference between a woman sitting at her kitchen table and a woman performing for an audience. In Pioneer Girl, the bur oak year is there. The weight of the debt is present. The specific failures, not softened into general hardship but named as what they were, appear in ways they never did in the published books. For Little House scholars, the annotated Pioneer Girl was a revelation. It demonstrated in the most direct possible way how much economic reality had been in the original material and how deliberately it had been reshaped. The gap between what Laura remembered and what the books contained was not vague. It was documented, footnoted, traceable paragraph by paragraph. And 3 years later, in 2017, Caroline Fraser published Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Fraser won the Pulitzer Prize for that book, and what she did, carefully, compassionately, with extraordinary archival depth, was put the census records and the land filings and the probate documents and the agricultural schedules next to the books, chapter by chapter, claim by claim, and let the gap between them tell its own story. Prairie Fires did not call Laura a fraud. It did not call Pa a failure or the Wilders villains. It did what good history does. It showed the full ledger, both pages, the love and the arithmetic, and it let readers decide what the arithmetic meant. The response was remarkable. The book won the Pulitzer. It sold to a general audience. It was reviewed not just in literary journals, but in mainstream newspapers and magazines. People who had loved the Little House books their entire lives read Prairie Fires and sat with it and felt, many of them, by their own accounts, a quiet shift in what they thought they had always known. That feeling is what this documentary has been building towards since the first chapter. Because here is the thing about a myth you love. When you find out it was incomplete, it doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like grief, not anger, not outrage. Just the quiet ache of realizing that the story you grew up inside was missing something essential. That Pa was a more complicated man than the books allowed him to be. That the frontier was a more unequal place than the television show suggested. That the full barn and the empty cellar were not equally representative of what hard work on the American frontier produced. And that pretending otherwise, for a century, in classrooms, in libraries, on prime-time television, had consequences that went beyond literary interpretation. If you grew up reading those books, that grief is real. Honour it. But then open the other ledger page, because here is what the fuller story actually gives you that the myth alone cannot. It gives you Caroline Ingalls back, Ma, who ran a boarding house in Burr Oak and kept the household together through the hardest year Pa's story ever produced, the year Laura didn't write about, who calculated how far the flower would stretch, who managed a family's emotional survival alongside its physical survival, who did invisible economic labour that the books rendered as warmth. But that was documented and measurable work. It gives you Laura back too. Not the girl with the braids, but the woman who knew exactly what the ledger said and chose to write the love instead. Who was not naive about the arithmetic, but was loyal to the people behind it. Who was not suppressing the truth, but protecting something she loved more than precision. That is a human choice, and it is more interesting than either a saint or a liar. It gives you Almanzo back, not as a simple success story, but as a man whose genuine advantages did not save him from the frontier's worst years, only gave him different tools for the rebuilding. The man who built Rocky Ridge with hands that shook. That is a more interesting man than the one the television gave you. And it gives you Pa back, not as a failure, not as a fool, but as a man whose particular character, restless, optimistic, better at moving toward horizons than managing the math of staying, was placed by circumstance in an economic situation that needed exactly the opposite. A man who worked as hard as James Wilder ever worked, in land that punished the margins in ways northern New York never did, without the capital buffer that makes the difference between a bad season and a catastrophe. That is a dignified story. It is more dignified, actually, than the myth, because it treats him as a full human being operating in a real economic world, rather than as a symbol of frontier virtue existing outside of history. In 2018, the Association for Library Service to Children, the division of the American Library Association that administers the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal, awarded since 1954 to authors who have made a substantial and lasting contribution to literature for children, voted to rename the award. It became the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The stated reasons involved language in the Little House books regarding Native Americans and Black Americans, representations that the organisation concluded did not reflect the values of inclusivity and respect that the award should represent. The decision was controversial. It generated significant debate among readers, librarians, educators, and scholars who had loved the books for decades and felt the renaming was either justified long overdue or an erasure of literary history, or something more nuanced than either position captured. This documentary is not taking a side in that debate. That is a different conversation, and it deserves its own careful handling. What the 2018 decision represents, for the purposes of this chapter, is something structural. A recognition at an institutional level that the Little House books were not a neutral window onto the frontier, that they were shaped by choices about what to include, what to omit, what to render as normal, what to render as other, that the mythology they created carried consequences, and that those consequences were not confined to the 19th century. The myth had always been bigger than a children's book series. The 2018 decision was just the moment the institution caught up to what scholars and attentive readers have been saying for decades. Here is the last thing this chapter needs to say about the myth. It was not a lie, and it was not the whole truth. Those two things coexist. They have to, for this story to be told honestly. The Little House books gave millions of children, mostly girls, mostly American, mostly growing up in hard decades, a specific and durable gift. They gave them a picture of a family that held together through things that should have broken it. They gave them a mother whose composure was its own kind of courage, and a father whose fiddle music turned a cold dugout into a home. They gave them a girl who was angry about unfairness and honest about fear and stubborn enough to become eventually a woman who sat down and wrote the whole thing down so no one would forget. That gift is real. The love in those books is real. But underneath the love, in the records that Laura chose not to open, the census schedules, the land filings, the probate documents, the empty de Smet lot where Pass died, there is a different kind of truth, one that the myth required to be quiet. The frontier was not a level playing field. One family started with a full barn and the accumulated equity of decades on good New York land. One family started from near zero, on borrowed credit, in country that punished thin margins with total destruction. Both families worked. Both families loved each other. Both men believed, with everything they had, in the promise of American land. But the ledger knew what the books didn't say, and the ledger is still sitting there, patient and quiet, with both families' names at the top. There is a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri that still stands. Not a ruin, not a marker where something used to be. The actual house, the rooms Laura Ingalls Wilder built over the course of more than 40 years, adding on piece by piece as the money came in, as the apple trees matured, as the writing career found its footing. You can walk through it. The rooms are small, the ceilings are low. The kitchen is the kind of practical that has no room for decoration. And if you stand there quietly, if you resist the tour guide patter and just look at the dimensions of the space, something occurs to you. This is not what wealth looks like. This is what survival, finally stabilized, looks like. And that distinction between wealth and survival, made stable, is the thing this entire series has been quietly building toward. We spent 6 chapters turning the pages of 2 ledgers side by side. We watched the Wilder barn fill in New York while the Ingalls cellar emptied on the Minnesota Prairie. We followed Pa across 5 states and 4 failed claims and 1 erased town, Burr Oak, Iowa, the place Laura never wrote about because some defeats are too honest for a children's book. We watched Rose Wilder Lane shape her mother's memories into mythology that the Great Depression desperately needed to believe. We landed on that 4-word verdict. The myth ate the math. Now we have to close the ledger. But closing it is not as simple as it sounds, because the final pages of this story do not deliver the neat moral that either side of the argument wants. They don't prove Pay was simply unlucky and Almanzo simply lucky. They don't prove the Little House books were a lie. What they prove, what the record shows quietly if you're willing to sit with it, is something more unsettling and more human than either of those conclusions. They prove that Laura Ingalls Wilder spent the first 50 years of her life absorbing 2 different economic educations, and that when she finally sat down to write, she merged them into a single story of frontier virtue. And in doing so, she created the most successful piece of class gap erasure in American children's literature. Not from malice, not from ignorance, from love. Let's start where we left off, with the wagon. It is 1894. Laura is 27 years old. Almanzo is 37. Their daughter Rose is 7. They load everything they own into a wagon and leave to Smet, Dakota Territory, heading for Wright County, Missouri. The Dakota years had taken almost everything: crops, a son, a house to fire, Almanzo's full physical health. What Almanzo's comparatively stronger starting position had given them: the training, the skills, The work ethic that came from a New York boyhood built around a full barn and a disciplined farm calendar could not absorb what Dakota had delivered. Nobody's starting position could absorb all of that. And here is the thing about that wagon ride that biographers like Caroline Fraser note carefully in Prairie Fires. To buy Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Laura and Almanzo needed a loan. The loan, according to the record as Fraser documents it, came from Laura's parents. $100 from Charles and Carolyn Ingalls. Charles Ingalls, the man who could never quite hold on to a claim, who walked away from Plum Creek with a mortgage and walked away from Kansas with nothing, who spent a year in Burr Oak managing a hotel just to keep his family fed, scraped together $100 so his daughter could start again somewhere else. Sit with that for a moment, because that $100 from Pa is not a footnote, it is the moral centre of this entire story. The man the books presented as the restless dreamer, the man the census records reveal as the chronically undercapitalised homesteader, managed, through some combination of savings, his wife's careful management and his daughter's teaching wages, to hold together enough to give Laura and Almanzo a floor to stand on when everything else was gone. Pa never had a full barn, but he had $100 when his daughter needed it most. Rocky Ridge in 1894 was not Rocky Ridge as the museum shows it now. It was 40 acres of Ozark hillside that the previous owner had struggled with for reasons that would have been immediately familiar to anyone who had tried to farm the Dakota Prairie. The soil was thin, the timber was thick, the work required to make the land productive was the kind of work that breaks men who don't have a reason to keep going. Laura and Almanzo had a reason. They had Rose, and they had something else, something the record suggests but rarely states directly. They had a plan, not a homestead claim plan, where you file your paperwork and hope the weather cooperates, not a frontier gamble plan, where the entire margin rests on a single wheat crop. The plan at Rocky Ridge was slower, more diversified, and, critically, built around a product that did not require gambling on a single season. Apple orchards, dairy cows, a combination of fruit and livestock production that would take years to mature but, once established, would not be destroyed by one bad summer. That's Almanzo's New York education speaking. James Wilder's barn in Burke had been full because the farm was diversified. Horses, grain, vegetables, the kind of multi-layered production where no single failure could erase the whole margin. Almanzo had watched that model work his entire childhood. When he finally had land he could build on slowly, he built it the way his father had taught him, not the way Pa Ingalls had gambled. Everything on one crop, one season, one claim. But here is what the record also shows and what we have to be honest about. It took decades. Rocky Ridge did not become viable quickly. Laura took in boarders, she raised chickens, she sold butter. For the first years, the farm was another version of the same grinding subsistence that had defined her childhood. Different soil, different state, same math. Almanzo's partial paralysis from the diphtheria complications, the condition that permanently altered his gait and limited his capacity for heavy labour, meant that the farm could never be worked the way a healthy man might have worked it. The physical capital he had brought from his New York background had been in part spent in Dakota. So the early Rocky Ridge story is not a triumph. Not yet. It is two people with their backs against the wall, building something, brick by brick, apple tree by apple tree, dairy account by dairy account, that finally, in the early 20th century, became what it needed to be. A real farm, a stable farm, a farm with equity. Now ask yourself this. Why did that stability come? Was it harder work than Pa Ingalls had done? No. Charles Ingalls worked himself to the edge of what a body can do across 5 states, across 40 years. Nobody could fairly say he didn't work hard enough. Was it better luck with the weather? Not particularly. The Ozarks had their own difficult seasons. What made Rocky Ridge work, where the Dakota claims had not, was a combination of factors that mirror, almost exactly, the structural advantages we've been tracking through this entire story. First, Missouri farmland in Wright County in the 1890s was undervalued but developable. It had existed as farmland long enough that the soil structure, while thin in places, was workable. It was not virgin prairie being broken for the first time. It was not climatically extreme in the way Dakota was extreme. The risk environment was different and lower than anything the Ingalls family had faced on the frontier. Second, by 1894, Almanzo and Laura were not starting from scratch as low-capital settlers. They had tools, They had livestock, they had knowledge, and they had, thin as it was, a foundation of farm management experience that took Pa Ingalls most of his adult life to accumulate, and that Pa accumulated too late in too marginal a climate to ever convert into lasting stability. Third, and this is the part the books never quite get to, Laura started writing. The writing career did not arrive fully formed. It arrived the way Rocky Ridge itself arrived, slowly, in small pieces, through incremental effort over many years. Laura wrote farm columns for the Missouri Ruralist beginning around 1911. They were practical, clear, grounded in the realities of a woman who had actually farmed, actually managed accounts, actually watched her husband's health limit what the land could produce. The columns were popular, they built an audience, and they built something else. They built Laura's confidence that she had a voice worth listening to. It was Rose, her daughter, who eventually pushed her toward the bigger project. Rose Wilder Lane had become a significant figure in American journalism and letters by the late 1910s and 1920s, a political writer whose ideas were moving steadily toward the libertarian philosophy she would later help define. Rose had left Mansfield. She had lived in San Francisco, in Europe, in New York. She understood markets. She understood what sold. And when her mother began writing down her memories, the raw draft that would eventually become Pioneer Girl, Rose understood immediately that this was material with commercial potential. The relationship between what Laura wrote and what Rose shaped has occupied scholars for decades. What the honest record shows is this. Laura provided the memories, the voice, the lived experience. Rose provided editorial direction, market awareness, and in some cases significant structural reshaping of individual manuscripts. How much Rose contributed to any given book is a question scholars continue to debate, and the documentary series dealt with it at length in the previous chapter. What matters here, in this final accounting, is what the writing career meant economically. It meant that Rocky Ridge finally became solvent. The first book, Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932 by Harper & Brothers, sold well despite the Depression, or perhaps because of it. The Depression was the crucial context. America in 1932 was not looking for complexity. It was not looking for a careful accounting of frontier capital advantages and structural disadvantages. It was looking for evidence that hard work and love and family could get you through anything. Laura's books provided that evidence in the most vivid, most beautifully written form imaginable. The myth arrived exactly when America needed it most, and that timing is not a coincidence you can wave away. It is the key to understanding why the economic gap between the Wilder barn and the Ingalls cellar disappeared so completely from the public imagination. The 1930s needed Pa Ingalls to be an everyman hero. The 1930s needed his goodness to be enough. The 1930s could not afford, emotionally, politically, psychologically, to hear that the hard-working pioneer farmer's fate was determined less by character than by capital. So Laura gave America what it needed, and she was not wrong to do so. That's the thing that takes a moment to land. She was writing for children. She was writing through the Depression. She was writing with the particular tenderness of a woman who had watched her father love his family completely while failing to provide for them reliably, and who had made peace with that contradiction long before she put it on the page. What she gave the books was the emotional truth of her childhood, that Pa was good, that love was real, that the prairie was beautiful, that hard work mattered. All of those things were true. What she left out was the structural truth, that Pa's goodness was not enough to hold a claim in a climate that destroyed margins, that love did not fill the cellar after the grasshoppers came, that hard work looked different depending on whether you had a full barn or an empty one behind you when you started. She left it out not because she didn't know it. She left it out because she had lived it, and she understood, the way someone who has actually been hungry understands, that there are things children do not need to carry. That is not dishonesty. That is a mother's mercy. But we're adults, and we can carry it. Charles Philip Ingalls died in Smet, South Dakota on June 8, 1902. He was 66 years old. He had spent the last decade of his life in a small house in town, not on a successful farm, not on a proved-up claim with full title and equity, but in a rented house in a small Dakota town, sustained by his wife's careful management and whatever his daughters could contribute. His estate, by the accounts historians have been able to reconstruct, was modest. Not nothing, but nothing like the accumulation of a man who had made the frontier work the way the book suggested it could. He died having never left Dakota Territory after arriving there in the late 1870s, and Almanzo's father, James Wilder, the man whose big New York barn first gave us the image of what a full frontier life could look like, had died just a few years before Charles at Spring Valley, Minnesota. Biographers place his death around 1899, though the exact records are thin. The Wilder family had sold the New York farm and moved to Minnesota from a position of choice, of accumulated equity, of a transaction that moved them up, not out of desperation. When James Wilder died, the family had been farming successfully across 2 states, had raised children who carried genuine farm skills, and had built the kind of multi-generational agricultural continuity that the Ingalls family in all their motion had never managed to establish. 2 men, same era, same stated values, same belief in hard work, land and the frontier promise. 1 barn full, 1 cellar bare. Here is the question that sits underneath all of it, and that this series has been quietly asking since the first chapter. What do we do with the knowledge that the frontier myth wasn't equally available to everyone who believed in it? Not what do we do with Pa. Pa gets to be who he was, fully and completely, a man whose love and courage were entirely real, even when his economics were entirely precarious. Not what do we do with Almanzo. Almanzo gets to be who he was, a man whose advantages were structural and real without making him a villain. Not what do we do with Laura. Laura gets to be the writer she was, shaped by both worlds, honest enough to remember them both, wise enough to know which parts to give to children and which parts to carry herself. What do we do with the story? Because here's what the record actually proves. The frontier myth, the idea that character alone determines whether a family makes it, was always incomplete. Not false, incomplete. The character was real, the work was real, the love was real, and none of it was sufficient on its own to overcome what capital, land equity, market access, diversified production, community infrastructure, and starting position determined long before any individual made a single decision about what crop to plant or which claim to file. That is not a comfortable thought. It is also not a new one. Rocky Ridge Farm is open to visitors. You can walk the grounds, see the apple trees that finally provided the stable income that wheat never had, stand in the small dining room where Laura wrote the books that became the myth, look at the desk where she sat. The house is comfortable. It is not grand. It is the kind of house a woman builds when she has survived enough to know the difference between what you need and what you thought you needed. There is a barn on the property, smaller than the one Almanzo grew up with in Burke, smaller than the one we opened with in Chapter 1, the one with the piled hay and the Morgan horses and the full grain bins that could swallow an Ingalls shanty whole. But it is a real barn, a standing barn, a barn with equity behind it. And if you look at it long enough, you understand that getting to this barn, this particular, modest, paid-for barn in the Missouri Ozarks, cost Laura Ingalls Wilder everything her father had, everything her husband's family had given him, and 30 years of labour on top of all of it. Pa Ingalls never had a barn like this. He had something the barn couldn't hold. He had the books. The books lasted. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932. It has never gone out of print. The series sold millions of copies across Laura's lifetime and continues to sell today. The television adaptation that ran from 1974 to 1983 reached an audience that dwarfed anything the books alone could have achieved. The myth of the hard-working frontier family, equally deserving, equally tested, equally capable of triumph if they simply believed hard enough and worked long enough, became so embedded in American cultural identity that most people who grew up with those books never had a reason to question it. Why would you question it? The books are beautiful. Pa's fiddle plays. Ma's hands are steady. The prairie is enormous and terrifying and gorgeous. The family survives. But survival, as we now know, is not the same as triumph. And triumph, as we now know, looks different depending on which ledger you start with. The 2 ledger books are still sitting on the table, one labelled Wilder, one labelled Ingalls. The Wilder ledger shows what accumulated land equity, diversified farm production, and a full New York barn can build over 2 generations, and what it still cannot fully protect a young man from when Dakota delivers its worst. The Ingalls ledger shows what courage, love, and relentless motion can accomplish when capital is thin, and what they cannot finally overcome. The claims failed, the cellar ran empty. The Baroque year happened and was erased. Pa died in a rented house. But then, here, at the bottom of the Ingalls ledger, in Laura's own handwriting, there is a different kind of entry. Not land, not livestock, not grain prices or mortgage balances, stories. The Ingalls ledger's final asset was stories, and stories turned out to be the one thing that appreciated without limit, that could not be foreclosed on, that required no starting capital, no good soil, no full barn, just memory and the willingness to sit down and write it. So close the ledger. But don't close it thinking that Laura's success as a writer erases or resolves the economic gap this series has spent 6 chapters documenting. The book's success was real. Rocky Ridge's eventual stability was real, and neither of those outcomes changes what the census records, the homestead filings, the land transfer documents, and the agricultural schedules tell us about why 2 families farming in the same era, under the same frontier myth, ended up in such different positions. The myth taught us that character was the variable. The record shows us that capital was the constant. Both families had character. Only one started with a barn. And if you've been sitting with that discomfort for the last hour, if you've been turning these pages alongside me and feeling quietly that the frontier fairness you grew up believing in was never quite as level as it looked, then you already understand something about the American story that is worth holding on to. Not bitterly, not with anger toward the people who gave us the myth, just clearly. Because clarity, honest, patient, documented clarity, about who started where and what that starting position meant, is the only thing that closes a ledger with any integrity. Laura Ingalls. Wilder understood both sides of this story better than anyone. She chose to give us the beautiful one. We can honour that choice, and we can also know the rest. The ledgers are closed, but the land is still there. The Almanzo Wilder homestead in Malone, New York, the dugout site at Plum Creek, the small house in Smet where Pa died, and the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge, where Laura's desk still sits by the window, overlooking the Ozark Hills she worked for 30 years to make her own. Every one of these places is open. Every one of them has something to say that the books left out. If you ever find yourself near any of them, walk the ground slowly. Let the soil do the talking. It was always more honest than the myth,